We continue to explore how United Methodists experience the miracle of dialogue at the table that is marked by freedom, understanding, reconciliation, and grace. That's the attitudes at our table. And one of the common experiences at the table of dialogue is the experience of being exposed to knowledge rather than just exposed to personal opinions and personal prejudices. When we gather at the table, every person shares knowledge they have learned through their own education, their own experiences. Another source of knowledge is the tradition of the faith community. The primary source of that is um, the library of our faith, commonly known as Scripture. Um, Over 100 years ago, the leadership of our denomination became convinced that persons of faith would also benefit, along with these other sources of knowledge. We would benefit from a set of informed advices on contemporary social issues. These advices were later named social principles. This week, we're going to explore advices under the category of economic justice. One of the cherished insights I received at a table of dialogue was a comment from a participant. She said, "What I love about this group is our conscience." A member of the group asked her to clarify because that person's understanding of conscience was that moral focus of an individual which helped the person determine whether or not a statement or an action was right or wrong. That's sort of our conscience. Um, that happens sort of after the fact. But the response to that question I cherish. She said, well, the meaning of science is to know. Science is a body of knowledge based on facts. She went ahead to say, so many groups I've been a part of cherish the experience of pooling ignorance, pooling prejudices, pooling opinions. But in this group, we cherish knowledge. We seek truth based on facts. All of a sudden, I had a new meaning of the word conscience. C-O-N, the prefix C-O-N means with. That person helped me understand that the meaning of science, science, conscience, the meaning of science is to know. And from that time on, I've cherished the United Methodist table and our conscience at the table, which is represented partly in the social principles. I was an active bishop for 16 years. Often I would respond to inquiries concerning social issues, sometimes from a layperson, sometimes from a clergy, often from the media. Letting our conscience be our guide, according to this friend of mine, was allowing knowledge to be our guide. Before we act, before we speak, what is relevant is our conscience, our body of knowledge. And so when I would get a question, what did I have next to me on my desk every day in case a phone call came, the social principles. They would ask me, for instance, what's church's position on, or what's your position on genetic engineering? And I would read from the social principles. And that became an invaluable resource for me to be sure that I didn't share a prejudice or an opinion or my ignorance, but rather I shared our conscience, our body of knowledge. You see, the scientific method is our search and dependence on collective and common knowledge. And we affirm that scientific principle in our work at the table together. By the way, this person that enabled me to grow in my understanding of what our conscience is all about was a layperson from a country other than my own. Now, our social principles define economic justice as our common embrace of the charge to share the abundance of God's creation in just and equitable ways. This charge is anchored in the witness of Jesus. One of the verses in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew is oftentimes at the end of a paragraph, and so it's just read and dismissed. But it reads, "Give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you." That thread of trying to get at the issue of economic justice is throughout the teachings of Jesus. Now, this section of economic justice in our social principles addresses 5 subjects, and let's review all 5. First of all, the subject of responsible consumerism. Individuals, families, and congregations are urged to adopt habits that reduce unnecessary waste, promote equitable compensation, promote sustainability, and reduce the over-reliance on fossil fuels. Responsible consumerism has to do with how we spend the resources we have and what we decide to purchase or buy for our benefit and the benefit of others. Consumerism as a role of economic justice. Secondly, farming and agricultural production. The advice is that we are called to be aware of how large agribusinesses have exasperated practices that reserve the best lands in many countries for the exclusive use of exportable crops rather than feeding local populations. Again, this advice reveals the global context and source of the social principles. This advice reveals the widespread practices for rich and productive lands in poor countries purchased to produce food for countries that can afford to pay the price for that best food. And that's from lands that have very poor populations. It's not their lands are being used to feed their people. Their lands are being used for the economic greed of employers and businesses, taking advantage of cheap labor to produce good food from rich soil for lands like the one in which I live. Thirdly, it talks about the dignity of work. This advice includes that one of the purposes of work is to contribute to the common good. For as we work, it is not only for our own benefit, it is for the common good. And we're advised to oppose the widespread, growing reliance on child labor throughout the world, including the country in which I live. Child labor, which forces children in many countries to forego education, which would serve them for a lifetime, in order to work to serve the economic greed of employers taking advantage of cheap labor. Fourth, Sabbath and renewal time. We are urged to affirm the importance of taking time away from work to rest and renew the mind, body, and spirit. Engage in play and recreation, serving the need of our communities. I will never forget the session we had on the social principles many years ago dealing with this subject, and the spouse saying to their spouse, honey, I think this says our 70-hour weeks have got to come to an end for the sake of each other, our family, our friends, and community. That's the advice of the social principles. Finally, it deals with corporate responsibility. It includes this statement, quote, rather than merely producing profits for their shareholders, we believe corporations and businesses have significant roles to play in promoting the social and economic health and welfare of society. These entities are called on to place people above profits. And those of us who have retirement plans that benefit from escalating values of stocks are oftentimes the direct recipients of corporate decisions that are placing profits over people. I benefit from that when the stock prices go higher. So part of my role as a person of faith is urging those corporations who are making a profit for my benefit to back off from that a bit for the benefit of the common good. Yes, the mission of the church includes the commitment to economic justice for all God's children in all of God's world. For your thought and conversation, I would raise these questions. Which of these advices raises new issues for you in your journey of faith? Secondly, when and how have you learned that responsible consumerism is an expression of your faith? Finally, What are the good news stories of corporations and businesses placing people over profits? Thanks for being a part of our journey of receiving our conscience, our knowledge.